tell you like right now, gain, dynamics, and EQ are the biggest tools to learn in this toolbox of like, what can I do to each individual channel to help shape how it sounds. Now, a lot of it's super subjective. I hope I've given you some like good tips and tricks to how you get started. And so there's a few more things I want to go over as far as just navigation, how to do some other things on the console, some effects and things like that that are, you know, separate from that. But like in terms of like, what can I manipulate on this channel? That's the big list of it. That's the important stuff. Other really important things to talk about in terms of that channel layout. There's other things here that I skipped over. Like this is a delay. I can individually delay the audio coming in on a channel. Not a lot of cases when I'm going to do that, but like if I had a weird thing where whenever I play a video, the audio is ahead of the video a little bit because some video systems add some latency to it. Well, great, I can go delay that audio so when I look at it on screen, it's in lip sync. So that's an example. Additional examples that are like more use case things. Sometimes some guys go to the extreme that we talked about phase and how that relates to microphones and getting things out of phase and cancellation. One of the things that some people will do is when they have multiple microphones, like in a drum kit, they'll actually delay the individual microphones so they're in time with when the audio from those sources arrives at the overhead mics, which may sound crazy, but that'll get you into really, really perfect phase correlation. If every time I hit the snare, the audio's coming out of the snare and getting picked up by a mic right here, but now I have a mic that's overhead that's 3 feet above that, well, that audio is also getting picked up by that microphone. But now when I mix the overhead and that snare mic together, I get the potential for cancellation. Whereas if I take the snare mic and delay it so that essentially it's as if I'm moving that microphone up to the same location as that overhead mic, well, now the audio from that snare is in line for both of those and perfectly in phase. So you can go crazy with that. I never do that, and it's fine. I've never had a mix that I was like, man, I really wish I had delayed my snare to my overheads. But some people are all about it, and they claim that it makes a world of difference, but it's not something that I've ever put a lot of faith in. But it's there for you. So that's there. This kind of section right here, actually all this area, we'll just walk through real quick. So inserts. So I do have the ability to insert channels out to a couple options. One would be that this goes back to the analog days where when you didn't have things like compressors and gates built into the console, you would take a physical insert off the back of a channel, you'd go out and go into a physical device that was in a rack that was a gate, you'd come out of that device and into a device that was a compressor, and you bring that back into the console. It was kind of a whole thing. We don't have to deal with that anymore because that stuff's built in, but I still have the option to insert signals, so if I want to send audio out to a physical device, I can do that, and then I can bring it back into the console and have the processed version that's gone through all of that. But that's not something we're going to normally do, so we won't spend a lot of time on it. But one of the nice things on this desk is you do have this little section of premium racks, which are currently empty, and we could add some stuff to, and we'll tinker, we may add something or not. But there's some actual, some fancier devices that I can mount and add in here. So you'll see this is a nice EQ, this is a nice compressor, this is a nice magical device for making devices not feedback. I'll show you some more of that later, but that's a nifty little tool that does some black magic, called a Portico 5045 that it's almost like a gate for speech, but it doesn't, you're not going to hear it like you would a gate, but it's going to basically clamp down a signal when it's not being used to help minimize the chance of feedback from just ambient noise and things like that. It's awesome. This is a great fancy compressor, another fancy compressor, a fancy EQ, a dynamic EQ, which is cool, another kind of compressor, and this is a multi-band compressor. All that to say, there's some neat tools there that you can actually insert individual channels through. If you wanted to go apply a multi-band compressor to a vocal, what a multi-band compressor does, this one's actually super neat. I'm gonna go ahead and just put this in here and show you. A multi-band compressor basically acts as a compressor, but it's 4 compressors in one. It's basically splitting up the signal into low, mid, high, mid, and high, and compressing each band individually. So I can have more compression on my high mids than I do on my high end or on my low end. And so I can use that to level out the sound of a signal automatically. Rather than compressing the volume of the whole signal down, I can compress just the loudest part of that signal down, or whatever part of it that I want to. So multi-band compressor is an awesome tool for some vocalists to really dial in what I want to do to tweak how they sound. I may put a compressor, a multi-band compressor on it and let it, really pull the high frequency down if they can get really bright or kill that mid-range. That's going to be what you hear the most when they get loud or change kind of from chest voice to head voice, things like that. But I can leave that low end more constant so it's there and still keeps the low end to it and just kills the stuff that gets a little bit louder. So that's a multi-band compressor. So we could put individual channels through that. And every time you mount one of these in here, it's 2 channels. So I can either do, if I had a stereo source, I could send a stereo source through that, or I have it in dual mode right now where I literally could have 2 totally independent things with totally independent settings going through this. So I have kind of the A side and B side to it where I can choose to have 2 different signals routed through that and have independent control of each of them. So with that, there's eight things here, so you can essentially process up to 16 signals depending on what you mount where. Put that back to a blank for now. So there's some really nice tools there that I can actually insert individual channels out to a processor, do some work on it, and bring it right back into the channel itself. So that's the insert. Direct out is not really important, but if I need to send signal out to a destination, just an exact copy of that channel, send it back out of the console, I can do that. Recall safe to basically disable a channel from being recalled by scenes, but I'm gonna skip over that for now. This fader section just essentially shows me what my fader's doing, so I can see that. I can actually tap on that and use the knob to turn the fader up and down if I want to. And I just get another copy of the on button. And then over here on the right, this is great. I don't know how much of these are actually being used right now, so a little bit. So DCAs, these are my best friend when I'm mixing. DCAs are what's called, DCA stands for digitally controlled amplifier. Fancy term. All it is basically it's a great way to group channels, to be able to like have control of multiple channels on a single fader. So when you're looking at this view here, you see there's DCAs labeled drums, guitars, keys, and box. That is essentially a master fader for everything that's assigned to that. So if I take my drum mics and I assign them to the drums DCA, well then when this fader turns down, the faders don't themselves turn down, but anything that's assigned to it I'll no longer hear. It's going to basically reduce the output level of those signals by the position of this fader. So if I have it here, I'm going to hear, if this kick is at 0 and this is at 0, I'm going to hear that kick completely at 0. If I pull this down 10 dB, I'm now hearing the kick 10 dB down. If I +5, I'm now hearing the kick at +5. So it's going to adjust how much of that I'm hearing. So you can assign DCAs by choosing which. There's up to 16 DCAs. Right now we're using 4, but you could assign this one to DCA 4 if you wanted to. I can also just tap on that DCA button and I get a nice pop-up where I can see the 4 DCAs, I can see what they're labeled, and I can see what's assigned to them. So right now it's not really being used, so it's something we could totally lean more into and add more stuff to use those DCAs that you can really mix with those, and that'll be a great.
So you say
great
right
tool.
now they are configured, so if we come
They're configured-ish. We'll get it.
Okay.
We'll clean that up a little bit today and tomorrow. So
I'm just thinking you come in here on Sunday morning, you're not getting any drums, and you forget about the DCA. It's because it's turned down.
Absolutely real possibility, but that's why I want to make sure you've got a good custom fader bank that you're using that has things like that in front of you, so that it's hard to forget about it because it'll be right in front of your face. But yeah, so that's what that is, and we'll get those dialed in a little bit. There's also mute groups. I really rarely ever use mute groups. I'm not a big fan, because if we are using the DCAs, that gives me ability. So like a lot of people want to think, oh, and they have a mute group that just turns the whole band off. I hit the button when the band walks off stage, it just mutes everything. The problem when you mute things is you just get this nice, very firm, like all the mics are on to all the mics are off. Just that like switch to silence that I don't really like. And so DCAs, essentially, because I can put all my band channels into the DCAs, now this is my mute. And I'm using a fade in the process. And so let's say you're doing, do you guys normally do worship before and after teaching, or do you do it just on one side or the other, a little bit of both?
Eat both, yeah.
So a lot of times, the kind of de facto thing in church, we do the big songs up front and we do the more responsive songs at the end, right? Like that's just like super normal and common in church. And so a lot of times when you're doing that kind of thing, the nice thing is these become your big picture mixing. So when I'm mixing, I like to build my mix with those sitting at 0, and I'm sitting here pushing faders around, getting stuff where I want it. And then once I kind of like have my mix where I'm feeling pretty good about everything relative to each other, I'm doing all this. Well, then now this is my big picture thing of being able to like turn the whole thing up or down, or saying I just need more drums, or I need more vocals, without having to. Again, if you had more drum channels broken out individually, it makes more sense. Right now, it doesn't as much. But when I have more of those channels, then I can be like, man, I just want more of the drums overall. And now instead of having to deal with 12 or 15 channels of drums, I have one fader I can move and turn all those up and down without having to wreck the relationship of how they're mixed to each other. I can just turn more of that up or down. I also always put my bass in with my drums instead of putting it in with guitars, because it's really more my rhythm section is how I want to think of that, rather than being truly just the drums. So then I've got my whole kind of rhythm section on a fader, and those can stay in check to each other as I bring that up and down. and then I'll throw all my guitars together, keys together, vocals together. That's a good starting place. And now I have the ability to just turn the whole band off by pulling that down. And then when they come back in for the more responsive thing after worship, I can kind of fade myself up into it, get to that level where I need to sit, and it can be a lot quieter than I was in the front set. And and I have the ability to build that if I need to using those faders. Does that all make sense?
Have you found sometimes when you mix an individual instrument, we'll say bass, do you think in terms of how it's going to sit in the mix? So sometimes if you mix something standalone, it's not real great, but it fits in the mix.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
personally, I kind of like some high end on the bass, so it kind of clicks, a little bit of high end on the kick, where it kind of clicks a little bit.
Absolutely.
Let the kick take the percussion, and let the bass take the note, but when they work together, it's not a pile of mush.
Yeah.
But if you listen to it standalone, it might not be that good.
Yeah, that's like I think what I was talking about, that electric guitar earlier is a good example of that. Like, I'm going to cut high frequency out of a guitar that if I was listening to the guitar play by itself, I would want to have all that noise.
Right.
But in the context of the mix and where that needs to sit relative to everything else, I'm going to make decisions about how I know that needs to sit in the mix as a whole. And so sometimes that's a matter of turning the whole mix up and then hearing, like, I just feel like I'm getting high mid attacked off of everything. And then I'll go through and listen through, like, are my guitars just too bright? Am I getting too much out of that? Are my vocals, like, where is that building up across all these channels? Because they all sound, I like to start at the base of making each channel sound good on its own. Listen to it in the mix. Now, there's times where, because I've been mixing for a lot of my life, how I make it sound good on its own may already be taking into account some of those things about how I know it's going to fit into the mix as a whole. For you, it may be more starting with the guitar more flat and hearing all the sound of it and saying, that sounds awesome. But then when you get that up in the context of the mix, you'll hear, oh, it's totally just smushing all this other sound where, like, I need room for vocals and other things to have room to breathe. I need room for the keys to sit in that range. And so using EQ to clean up those different sources, I'm hearing what is best to each other. And some of the things, one of the things that I think gets overlooked, like I was talking about earlier, is how important it is to talk and have conversations with your worship leader on stage about, like, the overall sound, because sometimes the problem is not one that is truly fixable by EQ. Sometimes there's too many things playing too many of the same parts. If we've got two electrics that are playing very similar sounds, very similar parts, that's not benefiting anybody. So I can turn one of them off, or we can have a conversation about, hey, can we talk about what one of you guys play and have one of them play something that's down an octave, that's a little beefier, so that they're able to complement each other rather than fight for the same space. And so learning to listen for things musically, so it's not always just a solution of fix it with EQ. Sometimes it's to have a conversation about what's being played and getting to where it's like, yeah, the keys part and the guitar part are literally playing the same thing, and they're just stepping on each other. And there's times where I want them to play the same thing and be, again, together, or there's times where they'll fight each other. So being able to have a conversation about how the whole thing is fitting together and finding a place for everything, both musically and in the spectrum of, like, EQ and volume and all the tools that you have to bring that together. You just have to think bigger than sometimes the solution is not in the console. Sometimes the solution is a conversation with somebody on stage.